Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kevin. Thank you for being here at the second session of 2022 IESBGA annual conferences. So I'm so glad to be a moderator of this session, discussing with the critical current topics of international trade. This session is talking about the supply chain challenges and crisis in the industry. So, currently we've been hearing a lot of challenges from the businesses, many different types, but especially supply chain scenarios to attain component is challenging to continuing smooth production with the companies. This is a reality for small businesses, manufacturers, exporters, and importers in every corner at this time. So today, we are lucky to have a speaker of Paul Jarzombek to talk about this current topic. So we appreciated Paul being a speaker on this important topic. As most of people know, the speaker, Paul Jarzombek, and the LR International, but I think Jeannie may not know. So Paul Jarzombek is president and CEO of LR International. As you might know, LR International is a global freight forwarder and logistic provider in the industry. And also Paul's career really spans 32 years in the international business and logistic industry. Definitely, LR International is widely regarded as one of the top leading authorities in a global logistics and supply chain trade compliances. So I think we expect to hear about what's happening on supply chain updates and the strategic recommendations to cope with these challenges. His update and suggestion would be very helpful for us to assist our small business exporters going forward. So when you have any questions and comments, please leave them in chat box or any time during the presentation, or speak out after presentations. I do not want to take his time much. So lend the hand over to the microphone to the speaker. Please welcome Paul. Paul, here you go.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak to all of you. We've certainly had many challenges in the last roughly 2 years or so, not only in our industry, in the logistics industry, but just anyone dealing in global trade knows that it's been just a very challenging time. And so what I'm hoping to do today is give you some historical perspective. You know, the problems that we're having today are not just because of COVID. That certainly pushed things over the edge globally. But this has been something that's been building, frankly, for quite a long time. And you know, it's come to a head as a result of COVID, but this has been an issue that's been sort of percolating for probably 2 decades or so. And I'll explain that a little further in my presentation. My plan is to give you some historical perspective, talk about what's happening today, give you some indication of where at least I think things are going in the next 6 to 12 months. I would love to hear from any one of you, any questions or comments that you might have, along the way, or certainly at the end of the presentation. Hopefully this will be a good interactive opportunity. My career, as was mentioned, spans about 3 decades now. So I can also speak to logistics and shipping or documentation, things like Incoterms, packaging and crating, risk mitigation, certain country-specific questions maybe, like what's currently happening with Egypt or Saudi Arabia or some of these markets where some specific changes have happened in the last year or two. I'd be glad to answer any of those questions. So it doesn't have to be a question specific to the sort of chaos we're experiencing right now, but you know, certainly I'm open to that as well. So why don't I, if it's okay with everyone, why don't I go ahead and share my, I've got a kind of a short presentation. It's really one slide with some different topics and introductory type statements, and I'll comment on those. And then, you know, feel free to interrupt me if a question comes in that's particularly relevant, that's fine. And then, you know, at the end, we'll certainly have time for questions. So let's go ahead and share the screen here, and hopefully that will work. Stand by. And we'll go to do that. So how does the screen look there? Can everybody see that, or is that coming
Yeah,
through?
it looks good.
Looks
Yeah,
good?
cool.
Okay. All right. So this screen is designed to guide us through, you know, some of my comments. And again, if you have questions along the way, let me know or put them in the chat, as was mentioned by Kevin. And then we'll have time, you know, also to talk a little bit later. So basically, where are we currently? Well, you know, I titled this presentation Supply Chain Chaos, and that's really, you know, I would say an apropos description. You know, we've had about 2.5 years here of some really significant changes. So I remember back when the idea of COVID was first coming out, and I especially remember watching television and the president at that time saying, look, we're going to have to limit the flight availability into the United States because we want to make sure that the virus is contained and whatnot. And I distinctly remember a comment where passenger flights, and then the comment was made that cargo was also going to be restricted. And when that comment was made, 1 second later, my phone rang, and it was my brother. He knows the business I'm in. And he said, did you hear what he just said? And I said, yeah, I did. And of course, that would be very bad. I'm in the shipping business. So if cargo can't move, that's very bad for my business. Now, it turned out that was said in haste, and that's not the way it went. Certainly passengers were restricted from coming into the United States from overseas, but cargo continued to flow. And at that time, we saw a major influx of PPE coming into the United States to be used in a wide array of places. My company actually did some shipping for the University of Chicago hospital system related to PPE. And it was just massive amounts of that shipping all over the world, including into the United States. Basically, my first point here is an unprepared industry and an unprepared world. And what I mean by that is, you know, COVID struck and it changed what was possible in terms of moving cargo and goods around the world, exporting from the United States to the rest of the world, and also importing things into the United States. And it changed that on top of an industry that is the global logistics or shipping industry that was already really unprepared for this kind of catastrophe. You know, in our industry, there has been a lack of infrastructure investment for probably at least 2 and possibly 3 decades. So with the exception of some new aircraft that was brought on by different airlines, primarily for passengers, not for cargo, primarily for passengers, aside from that and a few large ships that were built by Korean shipbuilders or some other Chinese shipbuilders or others, aside from that, there hasn't been much infrastructure investment here in the United States, as well as around the world, many places around the world, not all, but many places, at least in 2 decades and maybe in 3 decades. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the only ships that steamship lines around the world have been building are large, what we call trans-Pacific ships, ships designed to move cargo to and from China to the Western world, frankly. Those are the kinds of ships that steamship lines have been building. Why? Well, that is the biggest shipping lane in the world, really, from China to Europe or the United States or North America, and from North America and Europe to China are the biggest shipping lanes in the world. And so steamship lines decided, if we're going to invest, we're going to invest in the biggest market where we have the most potential. And what was their plan? To make the ships bigger and bigger and bigger to carry more and more freight in those lanes. Well, that means that any other lanes were neglected, that ships and other infrastructure like truck chassis and railroad infrastructure and port and airport infrastructure has largely been neglected, particularly in the United States, for all that period of time. Why? Well, carriers put their money where the money is. And so if they can live with a dilapidated airport cargo facility, they do. They just carry on because it's very expensive it's very expensive to invest in railroads and airports and ocean ports. I mean, these aren't small these are ginormous investments, typically geared toward sort of public policy, and there's a lot of politics wrapped up in this. Bottom line is, because of that lack of infrastructure investment, the industry was sort of teetering on the edge of not really having the capacity to handle global trade in the manner that it really should be handled. But without a crisis like COVID, it wasn't in the spotlight. We kind of limped along, and it worked okay. So when COVID happened, there was a stop by businesses, and there was a stop in the movement of cargo because everybody was trying to wrap their head around something that hadn't happened for 100 years. And so they didn't know how to operate in what we call the COVID era, which is sort of what we're used to now because we're on the backside of it. But at that time, nobody really knew what to do. And so everything sort of stopped. It started in China when COVID was first detected. And basically the Chinese government said to the people who were on Chinese New Year at that time, extend your Chinese New Year, don't go anywhere, stay where you are. And we're going to try to determine where we're at. Well, if you know anything about the Chinese market, it's huge. It's very active. Everybody knows this. Cargo that was there in China that needed to be unloaded right after Chinese New Year was not unloaded right after Chinese New Year. And so all of this cargo built up at Chinese ports and airports, and equipment that's used to move goods around the world was also stuck because goods were not being unloaded from that equipment. So the equipment couldn't be available to ship out of China and back to the United States. So now we have an equipment, really an ocean container crisis, because in the global trade business, cargo needs to ship out and it needs to come back, and it needs to ship out and come back on an ongoing basis in order for the equipment that's used to do this to be where it needs to be. So if a US exporter wants to send something to China or to Asia, they need to have, let's say, an ocean freight container that they can load to do that. If there are no containers available because they're all stuck in China, they can't load their export orders to go out to, let's say, Asia. So I say an unprepared industry in an unprepared world because nobody expected COVID to happen, really. And when it did, nobody really knew how to manage it. And so everything stopped, and it stopped for a period of time. And of course, volumes and activity in the global marketplace plummeted. And carriers like airlines and steamship lines actually reduced their schedules. They took flights out of rotation, and they took vessels out of rotation because there wasn't enough activity to support these pieces of equipment to move things around the world for a period of time. Manufacturers, particularly in Asia, stopped production for a period of time. They quarantined their people, and so companies that were ordering things from manufacturers in Asia or around the world weren't getting those orders as under the normal time frame or lead time, that they were used to. Things basically stopped, and this had an effect on labor. We all know this. Some people weren't able to work in a lot of instances, or were working less hours or time, and that was a big problem. China is always where carriers want their equipment because there's so much volume, so much activity to and from China. But when equipment is stuck in a place like China, it throws off the balance of equipment for the rest of the world. So for those companies out there, or people who say, we can just isolate in the United States, this isn't we're not globally connected, they're completely wrong, because what happens in China or what happens in Argentina or what happens in Europe affects what happens here in the United States, and vice versa. I mean, the world is just too connected these days for that not to happen. And so certainly COVID, and particularly the intense effect right around Chinese New Year when that happened, made a big difference. People had to shelter in place. We all know this. And so when that happened, there was a lot of activity around consumption and purchasing. And then when businesses started to reopen and understand that they were going to have to operate within the knowledge of COVID being out there and have COVID protocols in place, all of a sudden those orders that were put on hold were all released at once. And so the combination of consumers buying and businesses reopening created a dramatic surge in volume, not like anything I've ever seen in my career. And I would venture to say maybe not like anything other than back in the Industrial Revolution in the United States. The increase in volume was just dramatic. That meant that the carriers that move cargo around the world, because of this increase in demand or volume, were sold out all the time. And what did that do to prices? It drove prices way up for space in the marketplace. So at one time, air freight and ocean freight rates, were as much as 7 or 8 times higher than they normally were pre-COVID. At one time, we had cargo in Europe moving between Germany and Poland, and the wait time at the border between Germany and Poland for a truck driver was 75 hours. They would wait to get across the border to go from Germany to Poland, or from Poland to Germany. So these kinds of things were happening all over the world. There was a dramatic increase in demand, and the world was trying to figure out how to handle moving cargo and obtaining goods. Basically what we say is in the COVID era. And it was extremely challenging. So I'm just giving you some historical background here, or some background in the last couple of years. Certainly the industry and even government's lack of vision in terms of infrastructure spending really contributed to this, because steamship lines, for example, have a certain number of containers when they probably could have used 30 or 40% more containers than what they had to handle this spike in demand. Nobody really saw that spike coming, so it's understandable that they wouldn't have had a lot of equipment. But carriers historically in our industry have made do and gone on the cheap as far as equipment and infrastructure spending, And I would venture to say that some governments have done the same. And then when a spike like this occurred, they wonder why there's so much congestion at a port like Long Beach, California, where, you know, you have hundreds of ships waiting to try to get unloaded. And that's, Long Beach is probably the second or third biggest port in the world, certainly the biggest in the United States. There might be one or two Chinese ports that are bigger, but not really anywhere else in the world. So if ships are going to wait at Long Beach, California to get unloaded, they're probably going to wait everywhere in the world, because Long Beach is so big. So some history there that this is something that we've unfortunately been on the precipice of. We just didn't know it. And a crisis could push us, you know, over the edge in terms of not having the equipment and space to accommodate, you know, the surge in demand. So COVID created that surge in demand. It was hard to manage. As I say on the slide here, businesses were idle for months, and then all of a sudden they had to catch up and meet the demand from customers who were ordering their parts or whatever they were making, whatever it was. Demand was up, you know, 5 times over pre-COVID levels. And so prices in our industry increased dramatically, you know, as was stated. And still today, ports and airports and railroads and warehouses and container yards, both in the United States and abroad, are overwhelmed with the volume. Now, since COVID happened, we've seen some adjustments that have made the flow of goods happen just a little bit easier, but not dramatically easier, and certainly not at a pre-COVID level. The demand is still rather high. Many of our customers at LR are looking at record backlogs from an export perspective in terms of orders they have from customers around the world, which is great. But at some point, those long lead times, because of those backlogs, start to make the customers around the world impatient for these, you know, for these goods. So it's created some robust business activity, but it's been hard to manage. Certainly in the logistics industry, it's been very hard to manage. You know, we're expecting things like rates and space to be tight and rates to be higher, at least through the fall of this year. May even extend to more like through Chinese New Year of 2023, which is a high point on the logistics calendar, the international global shipping calendar, along with the Western Christmas holidays, the Lunar New Year holidays. Those two mark really high points in the global shipping calendar. And we expect rates and space to be tight, rates to be high, you know, certainly through the end of this year and probably through the end of Chinese New Year, which would be sort of February of 2023. You know, exports from the United States will and have recovered a little bit quicker than imports. However, it's still been difficult on the export side, particularly in the last 6 months. So customers we have that are exporting from the United States are experiencing vessel delays or from departing from the US, mainly because those carriers are having trouble getting their import goods unloaded here in the US before they then turn that ship around and head back to Europe or Asia, or wherever they're going. There's still a lack of equipment in the United States, although it's better than it was, let's say, around September of last year. It was really bad. It's better now. It's starting to get better. But on the export side, right now, about 80% of our export bookings at my company are having some kind of schedule change or variation throughout the duration of the cycle of the shipment. And in some cases, it's 2 or 3 changes. So we're having to educate customers on a daily basis that the pre-COVID expectation that you make a booking and the shipment moves and the ETA is basically when the cargo arrives is pretty much gone. That's not, we're telling customers, be pessimistic, expect delays, elongate your your transit time expectation or your lead time, sort of under promise and over perform with your customers around the world is what we're trying to encourage our customers to do, because an optimistic outlook about schedules these days for exports from the United States to the world is a dangerous thing. There's not much optimism in the schedules from an outbound perspective, these days. So will that get better as the year carries on? I think it has the potential to get better. We've seen an improvement since mid 2021. So there is that possibility that COVID now is a word that everybody knows what it means. And most businesses have had to adapt as a result of COVID. And so the industry is beginning to normalize around COVID as something that's just going to be part of our vernacular going forward. So that's in a way a good thing, because the market is adapting to the situation. There is still an equipment and space shortage, and we think that's going to continue. It might get a little bit better as the year carries on. We say exports will recover a little faster than imports because the United States imports, maybe 7 to 8 times what we export. So just by virtue of the activity, exports should improve a little bit here as the year carries on. And we're certainly hoping that'll be the case. And we've seen some of that. So some strategies, both for imports and exports, really. Plan well in advance. You've got to give enough time, whatever you think the normal time would be from a lead time perspective. Our advice is to at least add 50% to that time. Just to give more notice both to your customer, to your vendors, because everything is taking longer. For our clients, we're suggesting taking large orders and possibly making multiple smaller shipments, because smaller size shipments are making their way through the system a little faster than larger shipments are. And so this is just a phenomenon that we're seeing, that if orders are split into smaller shipment sizes, they tend to move a little bit better. Be careful with the West Coast here. It looks like there could be some labor action on the West Coast targeted for around June, mid-June, could even extend toward the 4th of July holiday. The Stevedore union on the West Coast has a contract negotiation that they're in the middle of. And it's possible that some labor action there could create decreased shift capacity at those West Coast ports. Now, that's primarily an import issue, but it turns into an export issue because the same port is used for imports as for exports. It's just a question of which direction the cargo is moving in. So that's something to be mindful of. Now, been getting a lot of questions about this possible labor action, and I have to say my crystal ball is a little bit cloudy. I don't know if that's going to happen. I just recently told a customer yesterday, we plan for the worst and pray for the best over here. So we're anticipating some kind of labor action on the part of the union port workers on the West Coast. And if that does happen, what we're doing for our clients is we're suggesting routing some orders and shipments via different ports around the United States, creating a mix of port use, Pacific Northwest, the Gulf, the East Coast, Canada even, so that if they do have some goods that are stuck because of a labor action on the West Coast, it would only be a portion of their global shipments, whether that's inbound or outbound. Maybe it's a third. At least some of their cargo and orders continues to move because they're not going through the West Coast of the United States. So we are suggesting that to clients, and they're taking our advice in many cases to try to get around this issue. You know, we expect that rates will continue to remain high, but they are starting to come down a little bit, particularly on the export side from the United States to the rest of the world. Rates are still high, but they're not as high as they were in the middle of COVID. And that is making a difference. The vaccination rates and other mitigation factors that the United States is using have been helping. Part of the problem at ports and airports and rail yards from a logistics perspective is that people were either sick from COVID, exposed in some way so they couldn't come to work, or had to adhere to lesser work schedules to try to prevent the spread of COVID. With some of these mitigation factors, including vaccinations and other things, we're seeing shifts of workers more closer to normal in the last 4 to 6 months, which means that cargo in our business can be processed closer to the normal rate pre-COVID. It's still not the same as it was, but it's closer. And that's been part of the problem is if you have 100 shipments at an airport, but you have 1/3 of the normal people working on a shift, they're not going to process 100 shipments. They're going to process like 30 shipments. So that means that 70 shipments carry over to the next shift. And every shift thereafter, there are shipments that don't get processed that carry over. And so that creates this congestion and logjam, this supply chain crisis that we've seen, at least as it relates to ports and airports and rail yards, you know, in the United States. Now, around the world, there's been some supply chain issues, really more because of different countries' policies related to COVID. Everybody has heard of the Chinese zero tolerance policy, and that's been China's response to trying to contain the virus. But what it has done is it's sort of sequestered people and made it harder for manufacturers, particularly in China, to keep pace with the normal order demand. And so what that does is it means less of those goods are making their way to the United States in a timely manner, and you have less items on shelves, whether it's baby formula or anything else for that matter. So the world really is interconnected. That's just where we are. It's sort of like saying, you know, we're going to go back to the way it was before cell phones. I mean, nobody could really imagine that anymore. It's not really possible. And the world is connected, and it's going to remain connected for forever at this point. So we're not really going to be able to go backwards. We got to go forwards. And with that interconnectedness, when something like this disrupts, particularly, you know, manufacturing and whatnot, you're going to see some shortages, and that's certainly what's happened. So the key really is some of these actions that different governments are taking, mitigation factors to basically keep people working, and then it's really a catch-up process that happens over, you know, a lengthened period of time. I think we're going to be in this situation probably for the rest of 2022, and hopefully as we get past Chinese New Year time in 2023, things will really start to move back to what we might call more like pre-COVID levels. The port strike on the West Coast has us concerned. There's no doubt about it. If that was to occur, if there was a labor action and it lasted for really any length of time, several days, let's say, or more, that's going to create a major backlog. We're quite concerned about that. So we're advising our clients to try to avoid it wherever possible. But again, that gateway, both inbound and outbound to the United States, is the largest we have in the country. So it's difficult to get around it completely, so to speak. So that's really, from this slide, what I wanted to mention. I've got here, let's see if I can get to it real quick. I've got my contact details here, just so that anybody who wants to see them, there's my contact details. If you're interested, you want to take a second, I'm happy to hear from anyone, with questions or whatnot. There's no charge to respond to people, and I like being connected with anyone who has, questions or concerns. You can always call me, and we can talk through issues that are, I guess, in my my area of expertise. But I wanted to make sure everybody had my contact details there. So really, to summarize, we were unprepared for how COVID changed things, the industry, the carriers that manage the industry, things like ports and airports and rail yards, really government infrastructure was totally unprepared for this. I'm sure everybody realizes that. And then this spike in demand that occurred because the world hit the pause button for a period of time, overwhelmed the logistics industry, created really high freight prices, which we're still seeing today. It's starting to dissipate or get better. We're not out of the woods yet by a long shot. I think we're well into the second quarter of 2023 before we see any serious improvement. And things like bad weather in the winter in the Western world, the Western Christmas holidays and the Asian lunar holidays all will play a factor. The real X factor, the wild card, is this possible labor action on the West Coast of the United States. That's no good if that happens. Yeah, I think that might give you some historical perspective. I'm wondering if maybe there are any questions. I'm happy to answer them, but I wanted to give you some background of kind of where we were at this point.
All right.
And I'll stop sharing here for now, and we could always go back to it if somebody wanted to.
Thank you so much, Paul. You touched base many aspects of what's happening for now, and also especially historical backgrounds that would be very helpful just to remind back from the 2 years ago. Okay, so as I mentioned that if you have any questions, just feel free to speak up from now on. Before anybody asks questions, I want to ask you, Paul, one thing first. Do you still think it is good time? It is not a good time for new to importers, new to exporters to start their import-export businesses due to logistic challenges we are facing now?
Well, they say the old adage is there's never a right time to buy a home, or there's never a right time to have children. You just kind of have to roll with it, And I wouldn't say, there are certainly a lot of challenges today that weren't here, 2.5 or 3 years ago. That's for sure. But there are always tough business challenges out there. I wouldn't dissuade a company from getting started, but what I would say is you have to go into it with your eyes wide open. This is a tough time to be involved in global trade. Prices are up, capacity is down, availability is down. Mm-hmm. The only good news is it's down for everybody, and the prices are up for everybody. Nobody's really exempt from that. So I think it is a challenging time, but it's challenging for everyone. So I wouldn't dissuade a new exporter or importer or company that wants to do that, but they do have to have realistic expectations. We've run into some clients here in the last couple of years who, you have to love them, but they're willing things to happen in a time frame that's just not possible. And you can tell, I can tell when I'm interacting with them that they just desperately want things to move quicker. And so they almost are talking themselves into that. Like, it's going to be here by the 15th, right? And we keep telling them, no, it's not. I mean, it's just not. So I think if you're coaching anyone in this space,
Mhm.
What I would say to them is what I'm trying to say to all of our clients in the last couple of years here. Plan for the worst, pray for the best. And if you do that, you're probably going to be pleasantly surprised a little more than you're going to be disappointed. And that's the reality. And here's the other thing. If somebody can get going on global trade and kind of make it work right now, it is going to get better. And so it should feel easier when it does get to that point. And, we hired somebody in my office and threw him to the lions in our ocean export group. And I told him, I said, if you can survive our industry now, you're good to go forever, because this is the toughest time there has ever been. So if you can tough it out, you're going to be okay, and he thought that was okay. Of course, he's pulling his hair out, but that comes with the territory here. So no, I wouldn't dissuade anyone, but I would say, look, you got to be realistic. It's a tough time right now, no doubt about it.
Thank you, Paul. So any other questions from the participant?
So,
Okay, yes.
Go ahead, Jim. You go first.
Sure. So are the steamship, first of all, Paul, good to see you, fellow deck member. And as always, you're right on top of things. And you were the first briefing I ever got from logistics when you did it for the deck. It's just, what can I say? Is there any evidence? First of all, they're just profiting off this, the ocean lines. I mean, the costs have not increased per se. I realize the staff are maybe not available, but UPS's stock doubled during COVID. I understand these steamship lines must be just raking in the profits. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, that is a fair statement. I can tell you that the core steamship lines that sort of make up those carriers that everybody watches, the kind of household names in our industry, they lost money for about 8 years. And then they made more money in about a year and a half than they had lost in all of those 8 years combined. They certainly have made money. Now, I'm not so sure I would go as far as to say that everything is the same for them and they've just increased prices because of supply and demand. There are definitely more costs that these carriers are bearing, especially in idle time. When you have a ship that sits there and sits there and sits there and can't be unloaded, that is very expensive. So that, coupled with massive increases in fuel surcharges or costs at this point for those carriers over the last, especially 3 or 4 months, have added costs. They've certainly had to either deal with staff that was sick from COVID or out or change. They've had to add shifts because they've had less staff in their normal shifts, so they have to add shifts and pay people more. I mean, we all know that the great absence of the worker globally here has certainly cost money. So I would say their costs are definitely up, but let's not sugarcoat it. I mean, they're definitely profiting from the woes of the world here. That's absolutely true. Airlines can pick and choose right now what freight they're going to take and what freight they're not going to take. We have a customer that has cargo that just so happens to be regularly 250, 300 inches long or longer. And we can hardly find an airline that's willing to take it because they're very full. So they just say, we don't want to handle it. It's a unconventional cargo. And so we just don't want to take it. We don't have to, because we've got all this conventional cargo that's easier to handle, and we're charging a fortune to carry that conventional cargo. So what do we need the long stuff for? So yeah, to your point, I mean, certainly the carriers in our industry have taken an opportunistic approach, to what's going on here. And there's even some, both in the United States and around the world, there's some action from a legislative perspective to sort of hold some of these industry parties accountable for some of this. There's some lawsuits that have come up that have said, look, this is predatory under the circumstances and shouldn't really be allowed. The problem is, we profess in this country that's a free market and that supply and demand sort of drives what's happening. And so, you certainly have people on the other side who are saying, listen, let the market dictate what's going to happen, even though it's unfair right now. There's probably at some point when this levels out a day of reckoning for those carriers where they're going to have to lower those prices, or nobody's going to book with them. So, I think that's coming. It's just a question of when will that be? But for now, they're doing just fine. I wouldn't worry about them.
Well, and which is why I think the labor will probably push pretty forcefully, knowing that, and also labor in general has such power right now just because of all that. But that's just a side comment. I still don't quite understand why the LCL moves are easier than FCL.
So the main reason for that, and what Jim's referring to is, we said, if you can make smaller shipments, they tend to move, a little bit faster. And the main reason for that is there's a segment in our industry that pertains to consolidation. It's a group of companies that have put themselves in the market as consolidators. They sort of work with the carriers out there. They even work with companies like mine who have exporters who need to get things from here to there. And what they do, what they specialize in, is taking smaller shipments from a variety of customers, putting them together, making one large shipment, and moving it from here to there. Well, those consolidators over the last 3 decades that I've been in the industry have steadily increased their contract volume and have become a very significant player in the marketplace. So these consolidators have their own contracts for equipment with lower rates, and they're a rather powerful lobbying force today. And what that means is that when one of those consolidators books a consolidated container with a steamship line, they actually get preferential treatment because they have such large contracts. And so what's basically happening is those consolidated containers, in many cases, are being taken by the steamship line on a particular vessel. And let's say Joe Blow exporter who loaded their own container with just their product, their containers being left behind, because they don't have the size contract that these consolidators have. And so by virtue of the contract power that the consolidators have, those consolidated containers are moving quicker, which just means we're telling our customers, hey, if you send smaller shipments, they're going to go in those consolidated containers, and then those are more likely to get on the ship because of the power of those consolidators. So it just happened. It's a freaky thing, but that's how it worked out, in the marketplace. That's why those LCL shipments or consolidated shipments, Jim mentioned LCL, that's less than a container load or consolidated freight. They're moving quicker than someone that fills a container entirely with their own stuff these days. That's what's happening.
So then this maybe answers the next question I had, which is a company looking at either working with someone like LRI or one of the really large, a Hapag-Lloyd or a C.H. Robinson, they're not necessarily going to save significant money on less than container loads being with a smaller forwarder or going with a larger?
Not really. Actually, to be honest with you, from a cost standpoint, making more smaller shipments is actually more costly than making one large shipment. The reason that we're suggesting this to clients is because if their one large shipment keeps getting bumped and delayed, they throw their hands in the air and say, we have to get this to Australia and it's taking 120 days when it used to take 45. What do we do? And so we're saying to them, well, if you can break that order into 3 smaller shipments, it's not going to be 45 days like the way it used to be, but maybe it'll be 65, but that's better than 120 or something along those lines. But it's not necessarily cheaper. It's just a strategy to keep the freight moving. So you have to wait. We'll talk to clients sometimes, say, listen, if you and your customer can live with 100 days, then just make the one big shipment, because it will be less expensive to do that. You just have to be realistic and understand that the days of 45-day transit times are gone. I mean, they're long gone.
I misspoke. So we have to give 3 freight forwarder referrals when we give them, and typically one will be a larger company. Although I just ran into one where the larger company said, I don't want to do business unless you're doing 10 FCL moves a year, which is fine because it took them out of the picture. But should we be managing expectations that they are necessarily going to be paying a lot more for the higher touch, higher service that an LRI is going to give for the ocean freight, as opposed to one of the larger?
No, I wouldn't say so. There's not a lot of significant movement in the actual freight rates. The extra costs typically come in the actual freight forwarder charges, which are more like handling fees and things where there might be a more consultative approach to interacting with the client. But those freight rates are not going to vary dramatically. I mean, you know, the larger forwarders do have more volume, which means that their core buy rates are lower than, let's say, a smaller freight forwarder. But it really comes down to what point they decide to price it in the marketplace, whether they're really cheaper or not. And that really just depends. Back to your point about volume, you know, the larger forwarders tend to want to work with companies that have a bit more volume because they match better with their way of processing those shipments. There's a lot of EDI transfer, and it's a bit more systemic in the way that they handle it. And as a result, if there is more volume from a shipper, then the prices do come down. I mean, if a large forwarder partners with somebody like Walmart, Walmart is going to get probably the best rate out there, or one of the best rates out there. That's true. I mean, that's, you know, that's for sure. I couldn't help somebody like a Walmart in the price point that they want to operate in. That wouldn't be possible for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Cheta.
Yeah, so you mentioned about the you know, strike that's maybe going to happen, and you mentioned the other, like Long Beach or, you know, Port Elizabeth and all that. When is that possibly happens?
So the contract negotiations are ongoing right now, but the timing with which it would come to a head, unless they settle things in advance, I hope they do, but if not, it would be around mid-June and could extend right up toward the 4th of July holiday. Somewhere between the middle and end of June is when this really should come to a head, one way or the other. It's either going to be that they're going to announce a settlement, or there could be this extension cooling off period. Sometimes they do this where they say for the next 90 days, we're going to operate as we have been, but we're going to negotiate in good faith and see what happens, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Or
So
the
that
union
affect
could
Long
kind of
Beach,
walk out.
and that will be affect Long Beach and Seattle?
It would affect anybody that's in the ILA, the International Longshoremen's Association Union. So it would be Long Beach and Oakland and San Pedro, Hunemi Port, any one of those that are in what we call the Alameda Corridor. That's that group of ports in Southern California that are really the largest system from an ocean freight port perspective in North America, actually. And one of the largest, probably in the top 3 or 4 in the world. It would definitely be those. Anyone in the ILA system.
ILA, okay.
Yeah, International Longshoremen's Association.
Got it. And
Yeah.
second question I have is, you know, talking about the LCL. So does your company specifically work with, you know, importing and exporting to Africa?
Yeah, Africa is definitely a trade lane for us, various parts of Africa. I think you mentioned earlier Ghana. As far as Africa goes, Ghana is one of the better lanes, you know, the US-Ghana trade. There are certain parts of Africa, specifically sub-Saharan Africa, some countries that are really challenging, especially with cargo coming from Africa to the United States. That's very challenging because there's not a lot of it, which means there's not a lot of service from those places. But Ghana's better because Ghana's in the, you know, 5 or 6 African country group that is very active with the United States. And so that's a pretty good trade lane for companies like mine or other freight forwarders. Okay,
and then you mentioned about the consolidator,
yep.
Right? Those people. So should someone like a small client of mine working with the consolidator versus you, what is the recommendation there?
So usually a freight forwarder provides a complete menu of services, especially for a smaller company. A consolidator is really just one piece, and there's air freight consolidators and ocean freight consolidators, but usually those consolidators want to receive cargo from a freight forwarder, primarily because there are some documents and some other data elements that a freight forwarder is very familiar with completing that make the consolidator's process very streamlined. And so for a consolidator to kind of stop everything and coach a new export or import client is unlikely, because their whole world is meeting deadlines and schedules based on consolidations. And they have to get all the cargo in and then meet cutoffs or deadlines. So to take the time to talk with a company that's unfamiliar with trading globally would be a stretch for them. So I would recommend you push your client to a freight forwarder. They will utilize a consolidator. If we're talking about Africa in particular, most consolidations with Africa happen via Europe, places like Belgium, France, even some of these countries that sort of colonized a lot of Africa have regular services. And so what happens is, if the goods are going to or from the United States from Africa, they make a stop in Europe. And that's where you pick up the best pricing between those lanes, because there's just a lot of trade between certain Western European countries and Africa, maybe even more than the United States for that matter. And so you kind of piggyback off of that volume, and that's how you get better pricing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep. No
Sure,
problem.
thank you. Yeah, thank you for your practical questions. Paul, we just talked about the renewal of a contract in the West Coast between ILWU and PMA.
Mhm.
So right now, I personally had a really bad experience. What is that? 5 or 7 years ago, every contract renewed that. So
Yeah.
at that time, I was the person who experienced that headache.
Mhm.
So, but when I facing this supply chain challenges, on top of that, July 1st, if we hear another issue with this, I thought it could be perfect storms
Yeah.
again. So
Sure.
yeah, so you mentioned a couple of things. So still, I'm gonna keep watching that from the media, but so far I think the negotiation has been kind of the positive or ongoing well. What's your prospect?
Yeah, right now, the word on the street is that the two parties are committed to keeping things moving.
Mhm.
So the idea of a work stoppage or slowdown or strike has been largely dismissed by these parties.
Okay.
But my concern is this is a long and cantankerous relationship. And
Mhm.
so I've seen it before where the negotiations were going okay, and then somebody gets their nose bent out of shape because of something that was either said or offered or wasn't. And before you know it, we have some kind of slowdown, walkout. They do these things called Blue Mondays, where 90% of the workers call in sick on a particular day. And it completely throws the schedules off. So I guess I'm sort of hardened by my 30 plus years in the business, and I guess I don't trust anybody, and I sort of think that something might happen here that's not very good. I hope that I'm wrong. You're right, though. Right now, the word out in the marketplace is that one way or the other, any differences are going to be worked through, and they're going to continue to process cargo. I hope that's the case, and if for some reason it's not, I kind of hope our government steps in and says, listen, let's put a mediator in place, institute a cooling off period, and for the sake of the country, let's keep things moving, because I can tell you that even a couple of days of strike, let's say stoppage, will create a couple of months of problems. That's pretty typical. It's just like when that ship got stuck in the canal, it was stuck and there was a problem for 4 or 5 days. It created, a month and a half of ongoing delays and problems just from one ship being stuck there. So I hope it doesn't happen. I guess I'm calloused by my time in the industry here.
I think we need to keep an eye on that, the July 1st and the Chinese New Year's in 2023. And Paul, I really appreciate it that you mentioning the strategy for the plan well in advance with the vendors, with the customers, with the flexibility, working with the collaborations with even freight forwarders and vendors. And also, I like your strategy spreading multiple smaller shipments. Even Jim asked the comparison in LCL and FCL in cost, but it's important to keep the freights moving fast. I agree with that. Thank you for mentioning about that. Anybody has other questions? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, Sylvia, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
Hello, hello. Curious, is Shanghai still on lockdown?
They're on partial lockdown. So it's been gradually relaxed in the last week or two. Our people there are part back into work and part still at home. They were at home exclusively, and even their time outside was sort of being monitored very tightly and controlled. It's starting to loosen a little bit. It's right now, I'd say about like 60-40 maybe in terms of their compared to their normal work schedule and whatnot. So it's starting to improve a little bit from what it was, let's say 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Because there was an article, I think a few days ago in the Wall Street Journal about, things are very, very concerning about once, the lockdown is lifted and European ports are on warning, everybody's on warning alert about, what's going to happen and so forth. And so everybody's on alert about what's going on about the West, U.S. Western ports and everything else. How are things with shipments to Latin America, South America? Could you update us on that?
Yeah, they've been, actually, that's an area of the world and frankly, Europe as well.
Yes.
Both Europe and Latin America have been running a little bit closer to normal. I wouldn't say normal, but closer. Really, our major problems have been more in Asia and Australia, New Zealand. Those areas have been the major problem areas for us for months now. Europe and Latin America have been pretty good, to be honest with you. Chile, Argentina, Brazil. Last year, there was some trouble in Brazil for about 6 months. There was some major capacity issues from a shipping perspective, both to and from Brazil. It's gotten a little bit better in 2022 here. So to answer your question, Latin America and Europe in particular have been minor bright spots, especially for export to those places from the United States. There's been space, and the service has been running not normal, but closer to normal.
And rates, what about the rates?
Rates have been closer to normal as well. So if rates to Asia, to and from Asia, are 125% higher than normal, Latin America and Europe are more like 30% higher than normal. Still higher, but more manageable. Let's put it that way.
That's good to know.
So it's not been too terrible, actually.
Okay. There's a bright spot there.
Something to hang our head on, I guess. So.
Yeah. And have you seen from the last year and a half, 2 years, anything that you can share with us in terms of any creative ways that you have seen from your clients, particularly small businesses, that you have seen creative ways how these small businesses have been able to manage? Any experiences from what you have seen in terms of they've been able to manage and overcome this tough couple of years?
You know, the really savvy customers that we have taken a look at the entire offerings in our marketplace and have actually broken down their, you know, orders, whether it's procurement from overseas on the import side or sales on the export side. They've kind of broken them down into silos or categories using these different services. So what do I mean by that? Well, if they normally shipped anything 50 pounds or under with UPS or FedEx, let's say, or DHL, someone like that, they've increased that now to, let's say, up to 100 pounds, you know, from very, very small up to 100 pounds instead of 50 pounds. Why? Well, those integrated services, those sort of quote unquote courier services, they've been running closer to normal. They have their own planes, their own ability to manage capacity as opposed to the commercial carriers out there. And so, of course, their rates are up. People like Jim mentioned UPS reporting record profits. They are. I actually own their stock, so I'm not that upset about that. But at the end of the day, these shippers have said, okay, instead of 0 to 50 pounds with one of those integrated carriers, we're going to go 0 to 100 because those integrated carriers have stayed closer to on schedule. We have customers who are saying, okay, in certain lanes, instead of trying to get a container in, I don't know, Nowheresville, Indiana or something, we're going to truck the freight to a port. Let's say Norfolk, Virginia, as an example. And we're going to have the freight loaded there. Why? Because we're able to get equipment at the port more readily, and it moves things along a little faster. Now, we know we're going to pay more to do that, but we're, in most cases, passing it on to our customer, and they're accepting it because we're keeping things moving. So our savvy import and export customers are looking at their entire global trade picture, and they're using those services strategically in a way to keep things moving. A good example, we do a lot of work for Garrett Popcorn, you know, the famous Chicago people. And they have done some remarkable things in terms of looking at their global supply chain for, like, you know, the tins that they sell their popcorn in, and even the corn and other things, and have kind of looked at it and made adjustments where necessary to either speed up certain parts of their supply chain or do it differently than, you know, what they had done, you know, pre-COVID. And of course, that comes with a cost, and not all of these strategies work out perfectly. But the idea is, if you've got enough of these various strategies in place, most of your orders, whether they're inbound or outbound, come in a manner that allows you to keep doing your business. You know, right. So they've done a good job of that sort of thing. We have other customers like that as well. So those are the things that I would say have happened. Of course, we've had the opposite, where we've had customers who have reacted far too slowly to what was happening. And then they're crying foul, like, why can't I get containers, or why are things taking 2 or 3 times longer? And I want to say to them, have you been living under a rock? Like, do you even watch the news or read a newspaper or anything? Because that's all you have to do to figure out what's going on here. And we've certainly had some of that. And you have to talk them in off the ledge, because they've obviously been busy with other things and just haven't realized that the market is completely screwed up, you know, compared to what it was.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sylvia, thank you for the good questions about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, right now, for that questions, I think I was told more flexible safety stock setting depends on the supply status by product and the supplier, as Paul mentioned that. But Paul added up to the flexibility of transport mode whenever it's available. So really flexibility and the new assessment with the frequencies from the company standpoint, you know, that's what the feelings I got. So we're trying to talk with our client based on that, but each company has different situations, but they should have more. Normally, when I faced these situations kind of a long time ago, at the time, my motto is checking, double checking, triple checking kind of thing. And then sometimes I can see the ABC analysis of 80% is 20% is a product. How can I switch that my the transportation schedules with the freight forwarder there? It's really requires a lot of time and efforts, but that is really saving money. So the what's your thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, today, you know, both exporters and importers, as well as people in my industry, have to work, you know, twice as hard to get the same thing done. And it does require a double, triple, quadruple checking. What we've found is that clients that are doing that and putting in the work are having, you know, more successes than failures. I mean, it's not all a lost cause. You know, schedules are able to be met, but we just, you know, it's just taking, you know, more work these days. I think there is a positive light at the end of this tunnel. It's going to take a little bit longer because of the severe impact that COVID has had. There's been a lot of lives lost and a lot of changes. And you know, the world just doesn't react to that so quickly. My prediction is that in 2023, we're going to start to see, as we get to about this time next year, we're going to start to see some, you know, somewhat significant improvement, you know, to what's happening. And part of that might be that people have just now woken up and gotten used to the kind of the new norm, if you want to call it that. But I also think that, you know, markets react and normalize or settle into the circumstances that they're presented with. And I think we're starting to do that now. And so I think by about this time next year, my prediction is that the situation will normalize to the point where rates will reduce. I'm not sure, frankly, that we will ever see pre-COVID rates in our industry again, unless there's a serious recession that occurs, which would impact volumes and decrease demand. Then yes, I think that could happen, because when that happened with COVID and the demand plummeted, I mean, rates just went down dramatically. And then when the demand increased, they just went through the roof. I mean, it was a really serious spike that occurred. I think that that rates will go down as of 2023 mid-year, not to pre-COVID levels, but could be an improvement up to about half less than we are now. And that would be a significant improvement. You know, at one point during COVID, I had a 45-foot container from China for a customer in Iowa. That now 45-foot containers are kind of special equipment, but the rate for that 45-foot container was $38,000. And our customer booked it. I gave them the rate. I said, I can't imagine you'll want to do this. And they said, book the container. I couldn't believe it. I mean, normally that 45-foot container, to give you some perspective, would have been about $6,000, maybe $6,500 pre-COVID. So you're talking a 6 times increase, you know, in the price. And they didn't even hesitate. And that was because they just had to bring this product in. And I mean, they had no choice, basically. But that's ridiculous. So, you know, I think I think we're going to see improvement. It's probably going to take until about a year from now where we see that.
Wow. Paul, I really appreciated your time taking to discuss this critical topic. Definitely, we hope to invite you a year later again to check it out. I really appreciate for your time today. And also thank you for everybody's attending with the good questions. We will keep it posted with this issue. So I hope you enjoy today's sessions. And then this is a wrap up for the session. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everybody.